And my next guest, Senator Marco Rubio of Florida. Many argue he's the candidate Hillary Clinton should fear the most next year because he's someone who represents a younger, more diverse Republican Party. I sat down with him yesterday in Miami for a Meet the Candidate interview, and here it is. You got a lot of universal praise for the debate, but I want to get into one specific issue where there has been some questions about a response you had, and it's on abortion. I want to just get this clarification. Will you support legislation that has exceptions?
I have.
Anti-abortion legislation that has exceptions for life?
I'll support any legislation
of the mother, rape, incest, etc.
Yeah, I'll support any legislation that reduces the number of abortions. So that means a 20-week abortion ban. At 5 months, a child, you know, you'll recognize it as a human being in an ultrasound image, and I'll support that. That doesn't obviously cover the whole gamut, but it reduces the number of abortions. I'll support any legislation that reduces the number of abortions, and there are those that have that exception. And what I've never done is said I require that it must have or not have exception.
Why don't you think there should be a requirement of an exception?
Well, a couple points. I think, first of all, the questions that people ask about those two instances are horrifying. I mean, a rape is an act of violence. It's a horrifying thing that happens. And fortunately, the number of abortions in this country that are due to rape are very small, less than 1% of the cases in the world. But they happen, and they're horrifyingly, and they're tragic. And I recognize that. I also recognize, because of the existence of over-the-counter morning after, not to mention medical treatment that's now available immediately after the assault, that should be widely available to victims, we can bring that number down to 0. That being said, I personally and deeply believe that all human life is worthy of the protection of our laws. I do, and I believe that irrespective of the conditions by which that life was conceived or anything else, and for me to be consistent on that belief, that's why I feel so strongly about it. That being said, I recognize that in order to have a consensus on laws that limit the number of abortions, a lot of people want to see those exceptions, and that's why I've supported those laws in the past, as has every pro-life group in America.
Where is the constitutional line of protection between an unborn child and the mother?
That's why this issue is so hard. There is no doubt that a woman has a right to her own body, has a right to make decisions about her own health and her own future. There's no doubt. And then there's this other right, and that's the right of a human being to live. And these rights come into conflict when it comes to this issue, and so you have to make a decision. And it's hard. I don't say it's easy. Listen, you're 15 years old, and you become pregnant, and you're scared, and you have your whole life ahead of you, and you're facing this. That is a hard situation. I tell people all the time, don't pretend this is easy. This is a difficult question. But when asked to make a decision between two very hard circumstances, I've personally reached the conclusion, if I'm going to err, I'm going to err on the side of life.
Let me ask you about when should public opinion matter in a decision by the president, and when should a president decide, you know what, the public doesn't quite understand this issue, I know better. What is that line, and what is it for you?
I think on foreign policy in particular, it matters. I think the president's judgment has to somehow be immune to public opinion sometimes, because the president has access to information the general public does not. One of the keys to being a good commander-in-chief is not simply seeing what's in front of you immediately, but being able to anticipate a crisis that may happen down the in 3 months, in 6 months, and 9 months, what's around the corner. You know, the rise of ISIS is a perfect example. It's something I repeatedly warned would happen, that there would be a radical jihadist group that would emerge from the vacuum in Syria if we didn't do something about it, and the president didn't. And in those instances, you can see how quickly public opinion moves. And so the job of a president in that instance is to act in the national security of our country based on information a president has that the general public does not. I think on domestic issues, obviously, you still can't be governed by polls. But I do think the will of the voter is important to take into account. And I think most important of all, on what issues you should be prioritizing on your agenda.
The Iran agreement. Let me ask you about what former Defense Secretary Bob Gates argued. Said he thought the agreement was poorly negotiated, very critical of it, but said pulling out of it would be even worse because of the international ramifications. This was 5 other countries were involved with this. How much should you guys be taking that into account in the U.S. Senate?
Well, we most certainly want to never do anything to undermine our alliances. But let me just say the other 5 countries of the 2, China and Russia, quite frankly, particularly the Russians under Vladimir Putin, have never acted in the interest of the United States and, in fact, have taken pride in thwarting our national interests around the world.
So you don't trust them at all? You don't think they should have been part of the process?
Well, obviously, you know, they've worked themselves into a position.
They have a veto of the United Nations.
But my point is, we shouldn't, I mean, what Russia feels about a deal or anything for that matter should not be determinative of the national security policies of the United States. And I think that also applies to others as well. If you look at the other nations that are involved in this process, they were led into that by the United States and became a part of it. And during the negotiations, the French were actually much more aggressive about what the conditions should be than the United States were. But I think it's pretty clear that even among our European allies, their interest is simply to open up the market of Iran to their private sector. And our interest is different. Our interest has to be different because Iran is developing long-range weapons, long-range missiles. And if they become a nuclear power, they can place a nuclear warhead on a long-range missile capable of reaching the United States. And I think we have a vested interest in the outcome of this that perhaps is different from some of our European allies in the long term.
You're something like more than half of the money that's been raised on your behalf. Some super PACs, some in your personal campaign, come from about less than 10 donors total. What do you owe those donors? How is it that you don't? You say you don't own them. We've heard people make this argument. Aren't they going to expect something in return?
I don't think so. First of all, I can't even deal with those donors because they're involved with the super PAC, and I can't coordinate with any outside groups. Second, I've always been clear my entire time in politics, whether it was in the city commission at West Miami, the state legislature, Speaker of the House, running for Senate, or now for president. I have an agenda. It's a consistent agenda. People buy into my agenda. If they like what I say, they donate. If they don't, they don't. They go with somebody else.
So Norman Brayman, who's been a friend of your family, huge donor, he doesn't get special access in the White House?
No. I mean, he's my friend, obviously, and somebody that I'll deal with on a personal level. Norman Brayman's never asked me to do anything for his business interests or anything else.
So let's take you at your word. Should Republicans then take the Clintons at their word about the Clinton Foundation?
Well, I think the concern about the Clinton Foundation that many people have is the influence of outside, foreign donors that have given to that, especially at a time when she was the Secretary of State.
Their argument is essentially a similar argument. This is for charitable causes. This is for rebuilding Haiti. This is for AIDS, to stop AIDS in Africa. And, that's not having influence.
Yeah, so I think the concern there is when you have foreign entities donating millions of dollars to a foundation for a family while someone is the sitting Secretary of State, and then you can link that to decisions that were favorable to interests in those countries, there's a concern raised. Ultimately,
how do you prevent that happening in your administration?
Well, I don't have a foundation.
Are you going to have a how do you build a firewall to have this trust be verified?
And I think the best way to do it is know what you stand for. This is what I'm for, this is what we're going to do, and quite frankly, you do it irrespective of whether someone donated money to your campaign or not. And that's just the way I've always governed myself. I have never allowed financing issues in a campaign to determine where I stand on an issue.
We have a deal with Facebook. The final question goes to them. Ryan Love asks, how does Senator Rubio feel about states legalizing marijuana?
Well, I've said that I'm open to medicinal uses of anything, particularly marijuana, and if in fact it goes through the FDA process and you can come up with a proven medicinal benefit to that substance, I'm open to that. I'm not in favor of legalizing marijuana. I'm not. I never have been. I think the country
that have, would you then use the federal government to supersede those state laws?
Well, the federal government needs to enforce federal law.
You think that you would enforce the law? Right now the law in the book says Colorado, you can make an argument what Colorado and Washington State are doing, and then Oregon and Hawaii.
I believe the federal government needs to enforce federal law.
Senator Rubio?
Thanks, John.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good to see you.